Yes, it's that time again. That time when we find another American animated sitcom centered around exploring the life of an American through the lens of a fictional family who have one overall unique trait to sort of lure you in at the start. In King of the Hill's case, the show that we're doing today, the unique element of it is the approach to the characters, which is done in a different way to other animated sitcoms of the same time period, that late 90s to just about 2010, by having them be real and sympathetic and honest in their connection to a grounded presentation of the world. Unlike other shows that go more and more fantastical with what they are doing, King of the Hill sticks with a focus on everyday life, through the visual of blue-collar workers in Texas, a group of people who very frequently get lumped together by the coastal elites that produce these shows into a stereotype of bigots and stupid hick southerners. And King of the Hill does something with its long-term run that really counteracts that particularly annoying representation. An annoying representation to me because I come from a part of the UK that faces the very same thing from the southern London twats, Yorkshire, because King of the Hill presents its main characters as being receptive to change and to others. It shows them as being able to understand that people are people, and to not be immediately hostile or violent or aggressive towards others with no provocation. I think you can kind of see in King of the Hill the sort of different approach to these family-centric animated sitcoms that would serve to inspire a show like Bob's Burgers down the line, rather than the other side that went more and more extreme in its absurdity on the Family Guy, South Park, American Dad, Rick and Morty side of the family. All from the same dynastic group, but representing very different approaches to the genre. But look, we wouldn't be here talking today if there was not a trans episode, or queer episode, or trans enough that I can call it that without pissing off most people, episode of this show to dig my teeth into. And there is one in King of the Hill's entire run, a little season 11 episode 1 entry named The Peggy Horror Picture Show, which is obviously a reference to that classic of queer cinema, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which, if you have the time to, you should absolutely watch. The songs are stellar, the themes are confusingly gay, and the acting is wonderful, especially from Tim Curry as Dr. Frankenfurter himself.
We don't want to be any worry. Well, you got caught with a flat world. How about that?
And I think it's a good reference to use for the episode, because, as we will discuss in further depth when we are done analysing it, the episode and musical both feature characters and themes that are not definitively trans, but also kind of are, or at least could be easily interpreted as such. And that's the little dangling of some spoilers there for you, to make you want to watch the video to the end so you can find out what the fuck I'm talking about. Who says I'm not a real YouTuber? Anyway, let's get into it. So the two key characters you need to understand for this episode and its trans side of things are those of Hank, the patriarch and everyman of the family, whose worldly approach is a rather guiding light for the audience, and Peggy, the matriarch of the family and teacher, who deals with a series of issues surrounding her femininity due to not matching an explicit gendered stereotype that many other women feel that they should live up to.
You don't even need me to make Spot Peggy?
Nope, I guess not. But that's okay. I didn't marry you because I need someone to cook and clean for me. I married you because, you know, the love.
Those are our main connections to the narrative of this one, and the lens by which we, the audience, are going to find our own interpretation on the trans/queerness influenced. The episode begins with Peggy having a clothing swap event with her gal pals, as recommended by some sort of girls' fashion magazine, an event that turns into a disaster for her quickly as she discovers that her fashion sense is more masculine than the others, her feet are too big for their dainty little shoes, and she is capable of opening a jar of olives. All of this is stuff that clearly upsets the character, probably due to that whole, centuries of telling women to match up to a specific ideal or fail that was encouraged by systems and advertising companies and religious organizations and politicians and men and just other women and honestly just about fucking everybody. Because it was pervasive from the top to the bottom of how we ran things, and still kind of do a little bit.
Oh, Shug, surely someone will want these overalls.
That is a hard thing to move past as a singular individual, and does require a strength of character and will in a superhuman amount to not let such a thing get you down. This carries into our next scene, where Peggy seeks reassurance from Hank about her femininity, which Hank does offer her in a direct contrast to what you might come to have expected from animated sitcom family dads, but remember, they can be good husbands and guys.
I just felt so ungainly compared to those women.
Why don't you call your shoe store in Lubbock? I'm treating you to some new shoes.
Thank you, Hank.
Which is a persistent message of King of the Hill. The joke carryover here between scenes is that Hank offers to let Peggy treat herself at Lubbock's very big shoes, so that she can get some more feminine boots that fit and reassure her connection to femininity. But unfortunately, the business has gone out of business, and Peggy then has to go hunting for a new shoe place in Texas for her needs, while also dealing with some rather unnecessary sassing from her niece, Louie-Anne.
A bracelet. It's what some women wear on their wrists. It's like jewelry.
Yes, Luann, I know what a bracelet is.
Peggy then finds this store, Clarissa's Closet, which has all the variety of shoes in the size 16 that she needs. For the queer people in the audience who are seeing the name of this place and going, well, there's an obvious warning sign of where this is going. Yeah, I know, it's pretty blatant to us, but it might be not so obvious to people like Peggy, cis straight people who've never had to engage with that kind of culture, Clarissa's Closet just seems like a weird name, I guess, not an obvious sign. Now, we obviously here have the continued idea that Peggy is embarrassed by her feet size, and finds it uncomfortable what such a thing indicates about her to others, who may take that as a way to mock someone.
Hello, do you have a pump in a size 16?
Which brand?
I mean, a common way that people attack women is by evoking masculinity in them. Oh, you have body hair like a man, or you're built like a man, or you look like a dude. All common assaults on femininity that cis women have dealt with for decades and decades, anytime they do anything that goes against those patriarchal perceptions. And out of my own sense of curiosity, I looked up how big a size 16 shoe is because, well, I wondered if it was even that big at all, and I discovered a few things. Firstly, for no reason at all that I can work out, New Zealand's shoe sizes have New Zealand women's shoe size be the same as US women's shoe size, while New Zealand men's shoe size is the same as UK men's shoe size, which is 0.5 less than US men's shoe size for the same length. Explain that one to me, shoemakers. Regardless, a size 16 women's is quite big feet for, honestly, anyone, as that would be about 31 centimeters long. So the episode is correct, those are big feet that general stores are just not going to carry for certain styles because of sexism. That's legitimately all it is. I mean, men can have small feet and women can have big feet. There is no definitive size range, though there are more common variants, obviously. As we will get into, this ties into the whole transgender thing, because one could see this as an area that Peggy deals with something that certain trans women also have to deal with, and have it impact their own femininity in a very similar manner. There is a shared struggle there, though yet again not an inherent one, because not all men or people born with specific chromosomes or whatever have big feet. I have size 9 women's feet, which is about average for a woman. Human biology is a wonderful and varied thing to marvel at. as long as people are not dickheads with it and abuse it to attack others. To get us back on topic and back on episode, Peggy meets another woman at the shoe store while trying shoes on. A lady named Carolyn, who bonds with her over the, well, shoes.
That is how I feel about these shoes.
Oh, here, you take it.
Oh, thank you. Peggy?
Carolyn.
I usually hear this, not say it. Nice grip.
It's a shoe store, that one should have been obvious. But also by some kind of connection of how they break certain conventions. Peggy then dumps on Hank all of the great things she learned from Carolyn during their time hanging out, and how much of a connection they formed so quickly around a camaraderie that Peggy doesn't often have with other women.
I felt this instant sense of camaraderie with her that I don't normally find with other women.
So you've got someone to talk to about this stuff now. That's great.
Yes, it is, Hank.
Now, you can sort of see the possible really terrible comedy premise and outcome outline lurking on the horizon here. The dark cloud of transphobia that is sweeping towards us based around some sort of discovery that Carolyn isn't really a woman. And that will both be used for laughter at the expense of not just Carolyn but also Peggy. And that truly horrific outcome is something that I think I have grown to expect just because the bar we have for trans representation is so low that I naturally incline towards us being used for mockery or gross factor or bits about our bodies/lives that are targeted at us. Ultimately, it's a knee-jerk reaction from years of media confirming that belief about it, but I am going to suppress my fears and my bias here and hope for positivity, because this is King of the Hill after all. This show is notoriously kinder and more inclusive just naturally by the characters being good people and them being good people being part of the, satire. Our next scene at a restaurant continues to reaffirm the encouragement of Peggy, as Carolyn expresses a desire to want to know more about how she so easily eats food without ruining her makeup. Something that Peggy reacts to in a way that indicates that self-doubt around her womanhood.
Peggy, you ate that whole sandwich.
Yes, I did. Ugh, I'm sorry, that was very unladylike.
And none of your lipstick smeared or came off at all. How do you do that?
This continues as they drive in the car, and Peggy offers more tips that she has learned for maintaining the image that she does to the confirmation of Carolyn. What we are seeing here is something that Peggy and a lot of other women struggle to find, which is people who affirm them for what they are and what they do without using it as an impingement or judgment upon them. It's a really nice bonding experience to watch, and I just hope that nothing goes fucky with it. Fingers really crossed here. Which does bring us to our next scene, where Carolyn goes home and her mum welcomes her back and compliments her on her wig and calls her son, and oh, shock, horror, Carolyn is actually a guy who merely wears a woman's outfit when they are out and about. Almost all the time.
I love the new wig, son. Gorgeous.
Thanks. I just had the best time with this new girl, Peggy Hill. I don't know what his real name is.
I also want to briefly mention the cool line that Carolyn's mother drops of "do not apologise for yourself, now or ever," which combined with her general acceptance of whatever her child is getting up to, does present a really comforting visage of supportive parenting.
Hey Mom, sorry I'm late.
Do not apologize for yourself, now or ever.
But we also discover that Carolyn clearly thinks that Peggy is also a drag queen, or a trans woman, or whatever Carolyn must be herself, and therefore is thinking that Peggy also is. We see now the seeds for drama being set, I think. It's pretty obvious the arc that it's going to follow, and it's just a matter of seeing how long it takes to get there. Peggy and Carolyn go to the mall, and Carolyn drops a line about how most of her friends are afraid to go shopping in public, instead ordering most of their clothes online.
Some of my friends are too scared to go to the mall. They buy everything online.
Which to the cis people might not seem like anything, but to all those queers out there, in whatever form their gender expression might be going, that is one hell of a getting called out by this show. I know plenty of queer people that will buy their clothes online because it's less judgment and people can't see them buying it and form opinions about that or harass them, so... Ouch. Carolyn and Peggy then both get involved in planning for Carolyn's performance show, which is, it's clearly a drag show to everyone but Peggy, I guess.
Now don't be afraid to move your head a little during the humming part, so people will know you're pretending to hum.
Mm-hmm.
And Carolyn also finally gets introduced to Peggy's family, with Hank being just happy that his wife has found a friend that she's really enjoying being around, and Bobby being way too invested in his own plotline of figuring out this darn joke book.
Bobby, this is my new friend, Carolyn. Carolyn, my son Bobby.
Hey.
Carolyn suddenly starts clicking that something is up when she asks about whether Peggy adopted. Because, remember, she thinks that Peggy is in a similar situation to her... kind of. Look, I want to touch briefly upon this right now and explore it much further after we're done going over the episode. But what is happening here in the Peggy Horror Picture Show is a similar thing that happens a lot in these older pieces of television and movie, which is a series of interpretations of drag and trans and queerness that are not necessarily clear in what exactly the people involved are supposed to be. Partly inspired by cis people not being fully immersed in that culture, and also partly inspired by the fact that a lot of people themselves didn't really know how to connect with their own gender in ways that we have become more accustomed to with time. What I'm saying here is that plenty of drag queens back in the day were trans women who didn't figure out any way to explore their femininity and be themselves except by being drag queens and using that more already established identity. As we can clearly see a lot in this episode, how Carolyn exists almost entirely as a woman while out in public, and is seen and connected as such by most people, in a way that not all drag queens do that, where there is a distinction between the persona they employ on stage versus the person they are aside from that. What I'm saying is that trans identity has never been a clear straight pathway from point A to point B, where everybody shares the same story and transition and way of expressing that. And for cis people to look at characters and go, well, they're a drag queen and they exist with other drag queens in a drag queen community, that ain't transgenderism, really ignores the complexity of those identities and the fact that drag queens can also be trans women too. Yes, my hair is pissing me off. Back to the scene. This discovery seems to shake Carolyn a bit, and she clearly did not expect to find out she was talking to a cis straight woman.
I imagine this is what it looks like when you're stabbed in the stomach at several different angles, huh?
Yeah, stabbing. Could I have another drink, please?
Which she then takes back to her mother and reveals how such a thing is, I guess, a big deal for Carolyn. Carolyn's mother then drops another bombshell take by saying this.
Mom, she's a real woman, and...
You mean a biological woman. Just because you were born a male doesn't make you any less of a woman. Let no one clip your wings, babe.
I love this woman. This is the best parent we have ever had on any episode ever in regards to the genderqueer kid. I'm using genderqueer there because clearly there is some stuff happening with Carolyn that ain't cis, but it's not definitively transgender as we would know it. Carolyn's mother's quotes are giving me life right now. And I do also think it's very funny how Carolyn has to be like, please stop being so supportive, I'm trying to explain a problem to you here. Like, that's a very real situation for a lot of queer kids with their supportive parents of being like, I get it, you're being supportive, I love that, but also please, for a second, just listen to me.
Could you stop being supportive for 1 second and listen? I've got a problem. I can't let a real woman perform with me. It's a drag show.
And we then discover from that the reason Peggy being involved in the show is a problem for Carolyn is because she can't let Peggy perform with her due to the fact that Peggy is a real woman. Or biological woman, as Caroline's mother would like it to be clear, because remember, that ain't what makes you a real woman in her eyes. And now it all sort of makes sense. The problem here is not from the cis-straight person towards the queer individual, it's from the queer individual towards the cis-straight person being involved in a cultural affect that is normally reserved from those cis-straight people. This is something that is absolutely real and happened a lot in the real world, and it did take time for drag shows to become more inclusive to those outside of the gay male culture being drag queens. As we can quite clearly see from, well, RuPaul's Drag Race, with RuPaul making comments only 5 years ago about how he would not let trans women who have transitioned physically onto the show, which led to a whole host of backlash, and ultimately, for the better, RuPaul's Drag Race ended up becoming more inclusive of those with varying gender identities in this cultural expression that belongs and always has belonged to the whole queer community. And my research into this RuPaul thing brought up a comment that's really fascinating because it reaffirms that element we mentioned earlier. As Sarah Andrews discusses in an interview with regards to the whole Drag Race conversation, how performing drag shows in the South was where she got the support she needed to come out as trans. And she also found them to be very inclusive of identities outside of just the stereotypical notion that we have of drag queens as being gay men who put on an outfit to play a character. It's an understanding of that kind of history that I really do think has to inform our own understanding and interpretation of this episode of King of the Hill. That really does have to make us get why the episode is the way that it is, and that we've only really started publicly and in the mainstream having these conversations over the last decade, well after King of the Hill ended. Anyway, the show continues with Hank being just super encouraging of Peggy going into this, and an all-round fantastic guy. Honestly, I get why he's the King of the Hill, because this man is a king. If you like guys and dating, get you a guy like this is all I'm trying to say here.
I'll be in the front row.
Yeah, that might not be such a good idea. Apparently, they single out newcomers and embarrass them. You know, like at church.
Well, I'll be in the back by the soundboard then. That outfit, it's very becoming.
And Peggy also invites her gal friends from the start of the episode to the review as well. Review in this case being, I guess, used instead of drag show to maintain the secrecy from Peggy and also being an accurate description of what drag shows do. Review and drag shows share a lot of common traits with each other. It's like the same entertainment heritage. Jamie then turns up to get a beer with the lads as he's trying to find Peggy and talk to her about Carolyn, saying that he is a close friend of hers, and at this point you might be wondering, who the fuck is Jamie? You've never mentioned that name before. Why are you saying it like we've heard this before? And surprise, surprise, Jamie's Carolyn. It's Carolyn in the guy costume, doing their best to not reveal that they wear drag or appear as a woman for a large bit of time, probably because that's something that can get you shamed or attacked or killed in certain crowds. So, keeping that part of you secret is something a lot of people did and still do.
Is Peggy here?
No, she's not. Can I help you? I'm her husband.
I'm Jamie. I know Carolyn. We're friends. Close friends.
Oh, well, that Carolyn is great. She's quite a catch there, Jamie. Well, what do you say to a beer?
I would also say here that something I really get from this scene is a sense of uncomfortability from Jamie in regards to their masculine identity and the connection to that. Something that definitely plays a big part in a larger narrative around the whys and hows of people getting into drag or discovering themselves through gender expression and exploration that breaks with the dictated convention of biology or systemic expectations. That was a very wanky sentence. Unitree's paying off, I guess. But we jump to Peggy entering the establishment holding the drag show and being blown away by all the performers and complimenting them on their outfits, because Peggy is also clearly a good-hearted person who is excited to be involved in this performance.
If she wasn't dead, I'd swear you were the real thing.
Unfortunately, Carolyn then appears and reveals to Peggy that she's a drag queen and that Peggy can't perform in this performance. To Peggy's surprise, as she believed that most drag queens are men, and yeah, the point here is kind of a mean one at Peggy for her to get wounded over the fact that a drag queen who she thinks of as a man also believed that she was really a man too, because of some mannish elements of who she was, and because she was at Clarissa's Closet, which is a shop for drag queens, as you might have guessed from the name.
Oh my God. You thought I was a man?
We have the same size feet, and you were shopping at the Closet. It's a store for drag queens, Peggy.
I didn't know.
Now, if this was the end of the episode, or like the main finale point, I would agree that this is a terrible way to go. This would be immediately put into the transphobia amount, that like this is the final big joke of the hour, but we still have a few more scenes to go, and I think those could be quite fundamental to pulling us back from the yawning abyss of transphobia and misogyny that is currently looking pretty cruelly laid out before us. Peggy is obviously taking everything really poorly, and her cis girlfriends are not helping because they are just feeding more and more her internalized issue with her own femininity, much like they did at the start of the episode.
Shug, you coached a women's softball league. If that's not feminine, I don't know what is.
We're trying to cheer her up, not tick her off. You want to get punched in the face? That woman's got fists like frozen turkeys.
Hank then finally gets brought up to speed on the whole situation with Carolyn/Jamie, and why Peggy's feeling the way that she is, to which Hank tries to be reassuring again, because that's just who he is. He's trying his best to be good as well, but thanks to the whole, well, male-coded understanding of things, Hank doesn't do a great job at it, because I guess he just hasn't really learned how to do that.
I have never felt so ugly.
Isn't this something you should be talking about with your girlfriends? You know, like that Carolyn.
Hank, are you even listening to me?
But Hank does clearly want to help, and so goes to the one person that he knows Peggy really connected with recently, which was Carolyn. It also becomes patently clear that despite hearing it specifically said from Peggy, Hank has not understood the Carolyn-Jamie thing at all. Like, he doesn't understand how someone can be a woman or a man as well, or something, and the whole explanation from Peggy has just gone right over his head.
Hello, Carolyn. I was calling to get Jamie's number. Oh, he is? Oh, that'd be great. Hello, Jamie.
And Hank then meets with Jamie to have a smoothie and talk about this problem, with Hank making it clear that he doesn't really know what's wrong or how to fix it, while Jamie is doing his best to keep playing the card of not explaining who he is to Hank, or that whole identity thing. There is also a comment here by Jamie about how in his feminine Carolyn identity, he views Peggy as a model of femininity, and that Carolyn wishes that she could be more like her.
And believe me, she adores Peggy. She thinks she's a model of femininity. Actually, she wishes she could be more like her.
Which I do think fits into that complexity that we discussed in regards to transgender identity in the past, where Carolyn/Jamie could very well be a trans woman who uses drag identity as a way to find some solace around something that just might not seem possible for them to do. Carolyn then shows up to talk to Peggy at her house, and Jesus Christ, Hank is such a himbo for not getting this yet, the whole Jamie-Carolyn thing, but whatever.
You think maybe you could talk to Carolyn, see if they can't patch things up?
Yes.
And Carolyn confronts Peggy, who is hiding in her sad blanket as a way of dealing with her feelings, telling Peggy that she needs to come with Carolyn to a place that will help her with her identity, to the assurance from Carolyn of there being no shame involved in this at all. She's not going to take her somewhere and then mock her for being looked up to by drag queens.
Will I be humiliated in any way?
I swear on my mother's unwavering support that you will not.
We then see that Peggy has been taken to a clothing swap with people who are possibly either trans women or drag queens or something else. It's not clear. But the show settles on that these are men who want to look like girls and to act like women, and that such a thing should be seen as positive reinforcement of Peggy's womanhood. That her clothing and identity is one that these people who want to be women aspire to.
Drag queens model themselves after strong, substantial, fearless women. Women who aren't afraid to wear purple gauchos and MC Hammer glasses. Women who only need one name to describe themselves, like Liza, Barbara, and Cher. You, my dear, are simply Peggy.
There is a very positive message here in how drag queens connect to a womanhood that is not based upon the patriarchal expectations of women, instead being more connected to women who stood out as icons of femininity that broke those models, or were strong and independent and fierce and could slay. Peggy is something they look up to, not as men who see her as a man, but as women who see her as a version of womanhood that exists outside of the expectations that have been referred to by me throughout this entire fucking analysis. If you've been paying attention by now, you should get it. It's an interesting swap as well, just to briefly mention this as an aside that's not in the script at all, with regards to how it starts and ends in this episode, with it starting in a clothes swap and ending in a clothes swap, and how Peggy can find community in different places and reinforcement of femininity in those places and not in that place, depending on how the people around her interact with her femininity. It shows how positivity from any source is better than negativity from certain sources. I think it's a good message. And the show ends on Peggy reflecting upon that notion and then happily joining in, being comforted with finding community and connection here, regardless of the gender identity or biological situation of the people involved.
I have got to have these platform sneakers.
They are yours.
So that's the episode, and I want to go over 3 things here. Why 3? Well, it's a good number, and 1 seems too low, while 5 seems like too much. Firstly, I want to address the idea of whether this can be considered a trans thing. And the answer to that is sure, why not? This was released in that period of time when people were writing queer characters to be sort of an amalgamation of queer identities, and the drag queens in this episode bounce around between what we would think of as transvestites, drag queens as we now know them, and trans women in general, in regards to how they act, how they're referred to, and how they present themselves off the stage and away from the performance. While the explicit word trans is not used to describe them, the word trans has not been consistently used to describe characters who either are absolutely trans, or are designed in such a way that they speak to a trans narrative. So that's not a required element for them to be seen as trans representation, or for me to make a video about them. Secondly, I want to address that yes, there were no trans people or drag queens involved in the making of this episode, or in the casting of the characters, and they had no real connection with getting drag queens to advise or consult on it. So we have to assume that this episode was written by 2 cis straight guys and a cis straight woman who just kind of vibed what they knew about queer culture from a distance, on what they had seen/heard from others. For those wanting the deets on the people, that's Mike Judge, Greg Daniels, and Christy Stratton. Not much more to say there than, if you're making a show these days, try and get a queer person involved to, help write it. Just a good idea in general. And with that noted, we move then to the third and final point, worth discussing before I'm awkwardly wrapping this up and trying to convince you to subscribe and like and give me money on my Patreon, which is whether the Peggy Horror Picture Show is good trans representation or not. Now, there are definitely some flaws here. It's always worth at least acknowledging that fact. The unclearness of the queerness, the lack of consideration about gender identity or gender expression in regards to the trans people, drag queens of the episode, who exist more as supporting characters to support Peggy's own journey to accepting their version of femininity, but I don't think that any of that necessarily takes away from what is ultimately a positive story. The drag queens are never shown in a light that diminishes them as people, that makes a mockery of their choices or identity, and Peggy ends the episode being very comfortable and happy around them and being friendly to them as they are seen as people, not just their identity. Carolyn, as the main drag queen / trans character, is given motivations and expressions that run further than just stereotypes for jokes and bits or gross factor, being a full person that interacts with Peggy as a friend first and foremost. Ultimately, the attitude that King of the Hill encourages amongst its audience is one of just accepting these people and then moving on with your life. Because being cruel or being rude is just not something you should do. And it certainly runs counter to the idea that people who live in conservative areas are automatically hostile towards the identities of queer people. Obviously, this is a satire by someone who sort of describes themselves as sitting in the middle of the political aisle. They don't express themselves as being one way or another. But it's pretty decent, and it's kind of a shame that this is the only episode that gets close to transgender identities in the entire 13-season run of King of the Hill. Though I suspect that if they had been renewed for a few more years, they might have gotten around to a couple more, and they would have been just as attempting to be kind or as warm as this one to those transgender explicit people. So, that's a 4 out of 5 on the made-up scale that means nothing, and that has no foundation so you can actually use it to judge anything, because I've never established it before this point where I just said that. I never said I was helpful in my episodes. Honestly, if you can't figure out my opinions on the show by this point, then you just need to rewatch the video. A number at the end isn't going to help you. You gotta take it all in. All of it. Alright, with that wrapped up all nice and neat, let's talk liking. And why not commenting too while we're at it? Maybe I could also interest you in a quick subscribe as well, or possibly a crystal clear share from the lakes of some glacial fucker. If you want the really good stuff though, in here we have a Patreon, where you can go and subscribe to pay me money that allows me to cover stuff like rent and food and electricity and internet and water and goddamn everything else that, costs money in the world to just survive. The list goes on and on, I tell you, it's a nightmare. The modern world is a mess, but it does let me make these videos to share with you, so I guess that's kind of a good thing. The names on the screen right now are those in the $5 and up category, and I really do appreciate each and every Patreon on that page. Or, wait, is it patron? Yeah, I mean it's called Patreon, but they're patrons. Let me do that again. I really do appreciate each and every patron on the page, as they truly make it possible for me to continue doing this with any sense of real financial security. Other than all of that, thank you for watching the video, and I hope you have a great day.